The child was 3 days old when they came for him. His mother's name was Agiatis. She was 20 years old, the wife of a Spartan soldier stationed on the northern frontier, and she had carried this baby for 9 months through a summer so hot that the Eurotas River dropped to half its depth, and the olive groves on the slopes of Taygetus turned brown in the heat. She had endured the labor alone, as Spartan women were expected to, without midwives from outside the city, without herbs for the pain, without crying out, because a woman who screamed during childbirth revealed weakness. And weakness in Sparta was not a private failing. It was a public crime. She had done everything right. She had exercised through her pregnancy as the laws demanded, running and wrestling with other women in the gymnasium until her belly made it impossible. She had eaten the black broth, the blood and vinegar soup that every Spartan consumed regardless of preference, because individual taste was irrelevant in a society where even meals were collective acts of discipline. She had prayed at the temple of Artemis for a son, because sons were the only currency that mattered in Sparta, the only product a woman could deliver that would secure her position, her reputation, her right to be remembered after death with an inscribed tombstone rather than an unmarked grave. And she had produced a son, a boy, alive, breathing, with strong lungs and dark eyes. For 3 days, she held him. She fed him. She studied his face in the lamplight and allowed herself, in the privacy of those stone walls, to feel something that Sparta considered dangerous. She allowed herself to love him. On the 3rd day, the elders arrived. 2 men from the Gerousia, the council that governed Sparta alongside its 2 kings. They did not knock. They entered as representatives of the state, which owned everything within the borders of Laconia, including the bodies of its citizens, including the body of a boy who had not yet been given a name. Because in Sparta you did not name a child until the state confirmed he was worth naming. They unwrapped him from his cloth. They held him in the light from the narrow window. They stretched his legs. They tested the grip of his fingers. They listened to the strength of his cry. They turned him and examined his spine, his hips, the alignment of his limbs. Agiatis stood against the far wall and watched. She could not intervene. She could not speak unless addressed. She could not reach for her own child because in this moment he was not her child. He was material being evaluated for its usefulness to the state. One of the elders paused. He held the boy's left leg and rotated the foot slowly. He looked at his colleague. Something passed between them, a judgment that took less than a second, but that would define the remaining decades of this woman's life. The foot did not straighten fully. The ankle turned inward, at an angle that might have been imperceptible to anyone not trained to spot deviation from physical perfection. But these men were trained. Their entire function was to identify deviation. And in Sparta, deviation was not treated. It was removed. He spoke a single word to Agiatis, a word that every Spartan mother dreaded in the silence of those 3 days between birth and inspection. Unfit. The child would be taken to the apothetae, the deposits, a chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, the mountain that loomed over Sparta like a permanent reminder that nature was as indifferent to human life as the state was. A place where things the city did not want were discarded. Agiatis could not follow them. She could not weep in their presence. She could not ask to hold her son one more time. Because in Sparta, a mother who mourned a rejected child was making a declaration. She was saying that her love for one infant mattered more than the strength of the collective, that her private grief outweighed the public good, that she presumed to question the judgment of elders who had maintained Spartan supremacy for centuries, and that declaration was itself a punishable offense. Women had been publicly humiliated for less. Women had been stripped of their status, their property, their place in the social order for showing attachment to children the state had deemed unworthy. So Agiatus stood in silence as they carried her unnamed son out of her home and into the morning light. She watched them walk the path toward the mountain. She listened until she could no longer hear the baby's cries over the sound of wind moving through the valley. And then she was alone, in a house that smelled of birth and milk, with empty arms and a grief she was forbidden to express, in a city that called itself the greatest civilization in Greece. But before I tell you what happened at the base of that mountain, before I reveal what archaeologists discovered centuries later in that chasm, a discovery that rewrote everything historians thought they knew about this practice, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Sparta built the most complete system of human control the ancient world ever produced. A system where punishment was not something that happened when you broke the rules. Punishment was the foundation the rules were built on. Every Spartan from birth to death lived inside a machinery of discipline so total that even other Greeks, people who practiced slavery and warfare and exposed their own infants, looked at Sparta and called it excessive. And I need to show you what they did to their women. Because the story you think you know about Spartan women, the empowered females who owned property and spoke freely and told their sons to come home with their shields or on them, that story is a myth built on a half-truth. The reality is that Spartan women were not liberated. They were optimized, engineered for a single function, punished when they failed to perform it, and discarded when they were no longer useful. What you are about to learn will dismantle everything you thought you knew about the most militarized society in ancient history. If you want to understand how a civilization can perfect the art of controlling human beings through punishment so constant it becomes invisible, how a system can disguise oppression as honor and call cruelty a tradition, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because what I am about to reveal goes far beyond the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you think you know about Sparta because I guarantee this story will shatter every assumption. And make sure you watch all the way to the end because the discovery at the base of Mount Taygetus changes everything. To understand why Sparta punished its own people more harshly than it punished its enemies, you need to understand the single fear that drove every decision the city ever made. Sparta was terrified, not of Persia, not of Athens, not of any foreign army. Sparta was terrified of the people living inside its own borders. The Spartans ruled a region called Laconia in the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese. It was fertile land, rich soil fed by the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains that created a natural fortress. But the Spartans had not always owned this land. They had taken it. Centuries before the classical era that produced Thermopylae and Leonidas, the Spartans conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and enslaved its entire population. These enslaved people were called helots. They worked the fields, harvested the crops, maintained the infrastructure, and produced everything that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war. The problem was numbers. The historian Herodotus estimated that helots outnumbered Spartans by roughly 7-1. Some modern scholars put the ratio even higher, perhaps 10-1. Sparta was a small military elite, sitting on top of a massive enslaved population that hated them, that remembered their own freedom, that passed stories of their lost homeland from generation to generation, and that revolted whenever they sensed weakness. The Helot revolt of approximately 464 before the Common Era shook Sparta so badly that the aftershocks shaped policy for the next 2 centuries. Every institution Sparta built, every law it passed, every punishment it designed, was reverse-engineered from one question: how do we prevent the Helots from destroying us? The answer was total militarization. Every male Spartan citizen would be a professional soldier from age 7 until age 60. No exceptions, no alternatives. No Spartan man would farm or trade or practice a craft. The Helots would do all of that. Spartans would only fight. And to produce soldiers of sufficient quality, every aspect of Spartan life would be controlled, monitored, and enforced through a punishment system so pervasive that obedience became reflexive rather than chosen. The ancient sources attribute this system to a single lawgiver named Lycurgus, who supposedly redesigned Spartan society in a single act of revolutionary reform. Whether Lycurgus was a real person or a mythical figure onto whom centuries of gradual change were projected remains debated. What is not debated is the result. Sparta became a society where the state owned its citizens the way other states owned livestock. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described it plainly. In Sparta, no man was permitted to live as he pleased. The city was like a military camp where every person had a fixed role, a fixed schedule, and a fixed understanding that deviation meant punishment. The geography reinforced the psychology. Sparta sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. To the west, the Taygetus Range rose over 7,000 feet, its peaks visible from every corner of the city. This was the mountain where rejected infants were taken, where criminals were thrown from cliffs, where young men were sent during their training to survive alone in the wilderness. Taygetus was not just geography. It was a symbol. It loomed over every Spartan life as a reminder that the state could send you up that mountain at any time and that you might not come back down. To the east, the lower Parnan Range completed the enclosure. Sparta had no defensive walls. The lawgiver Lycurgus supposedly forbade them, declaring that a city defended by men needed no defensive stone. Later writers celebrated this as supreme confidence, but there was another reading. A city without walls is a city you cannot hide inside. There is no barrier between private life and public scrutiny. There is nowhere to go that the state cannot see you. The absence of walls was not confidence. It was control. This was the world Agiatis was born into, a world where the mountain was always watching, where punishment was not something that happened to criminals, but something that happened to everyone, constantly, as the baseline condition of existence. And it began before you could walk, before you could speak, before you had a name. The inspection of newborns was not a ritual performed in secret. It was law. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Lycurgus with the detachment of a man documenting agricultural practice. The father of a newborn child did not have the right to raise it. He carried it to a place called the Lesha, a public hall where the eldest members of the tribe examined the infant. If it was well built and sturdy, they assigned it to one of the 9,000 land allotments that supported Spartan citizens. If it was poorly born or deformed, they sent it to the Apothete, a chasm near Mount Taygetus, believing that the life of that which nature had not equipped from the start for health and strength was of no advantage to itself or to the state. The language is important, not of advantage to itself. The Spartans did not frame this as cruelty. They framed it as mercy. A child born imperfect would suffer in a society that demanded physical perfection from every citizen. Better to end that suffering immediately than to allow it to compound across a lifetime of inadequacy. This logic, repeated across centuries, became so embedded in Spartan identity that questioning it was unthinkable. You might as well question gravity. But what actually happened at the Apothete? For centuries, historians assumed they knew. Infants were thrown into the chasm and left to die on the rocks below. The image became iconic, a shorthand for Spartan brutality, repeated in textbooks and films and popular histories without much examination. Then, in the early 2000s, archaeologists conducted a systematic survey of the Kaiatas Chasm on the western slope of Taygetus, the site most scholars identified as the Apothete. They found bones, hundreds of them,